pretty much everyone who's into astrology knows by now, Pluto is about to move into Aquarius, where it will spend the next 2 decades. And there are a lot of ideas floating around about what this transit will be about, and you've probably seen a few of them on this channel. And it's a striking confirmation of everything people have been saying about Pluto Aquarius, that the two biggest stories right now are UFOs and the emergence of scarily powerful artificial intelligence. In this episode, which is the first of a 2-part series, I'm going to present a way of understanding Pluto transits that, as far as I'm aware, you won't be able to find anywhere else. And the technique that I'm going to talk about in this episode can give us new insight into the major world events of the past 15 years. The Me Too movement, the 2008 financial crisis, COVID-19, the Arab Spring, the war in Ukraine, and yes, even the Trump presidency. Now, I probably sound like a lunatic who thinks he's developed some kind of master theory of everything, but what I'm going to present is really an application of some fairly conventional astrological techniques in a new and hopefully pretty interesting way. So I've got 2 juicy episodes lined up for you. In this episode, we're going to apply this new approach to understanding Pluto's transit through Capricorn from 2008 to the present day. And in the next one, we're going to do the same, but with Pluto's last transit through Aquarius. This was the period of the Industrial Revolution, of the French Revolution, and the American Revolutions. And then we're going to round things off by thinking about what we can deduce from all this about Pluto's coming transit through Aquarius. Sound good? Then let's dive in. Now, what I'm going to present in these videos centers around a feature of traditional astrology that was mostly lost to modern astrology and only recovered during the revival of traditional astrology over the past few decades. And that feature is the Egyptian terms, or bounds as they're sometimes called. The bounds are mysterious divisions of each of the signs into 5 unequal sections. Each of these sections is assigned to one of the 5 traditional planets, except for the Sun and Moon, the 2 luminaries. For example, here are the bounds of Capricorn. The first 7 degrees are Mercury's bound, the next 7 are given to Jupiter, the next 8 are Venus's bounds, the next 4 are given to Saturn, and the last 4 are Mars's bound. Now, every sign is divided differently, and the planets can appear in different orders. One interesting thing to note is that the last bound of every sign is given to either Mars or Saturn, the 2 so-called malefic planets in traditional astrology. Now, the weird thing here is that nobody really knows why the bounds are divided as they are, but if you delve into traditional astrology, you'll find that nearly all the major traditional astrologers use them. What do these bounds even mean? Well, one way to think about them is if there are different rooms in a house or different states in a country. All the bounds of Capricorn have something to do with Capricornian themes, but each bound has the flavor of the planet that rules it. So what we're going to see in this video is that the Mercury bound of Capricorn seems to have something to do with the financial industry, which is an established institution, Capricorn, but one concerned with trade, Mercury. And the Venus bound has to do with Hollywood, an institution concerned with Venusian themes like the arts and entertainment. But before we go on, and to make sure everybody's up to speed, we need to talk a little bit about Pluto. If we start from the idea that Pluto was the god of the underworld, then we can see how in astrology, Pluto has a lot to do with death, rebirth processes, and life or death situations in which we're pushed to extremes. And a big keyword for Pluto is transformation. Pluto was discovered in 1930 at a time when scientists were uncovering the secrets of nuclear and quantum physics. And of course, that led to the creation of the nuclear bomb. And this was also the time of the rise of fascism, an idea that went on to engulf the whole world in armed conflict. Pluto has to do with the revelation of that which is hidden and the unleashing of titanic forces which emerge from below the surface of things. Now, as I mentioned in this episode, we're going to talk about Pluto's transit through Capricorn. Capricorn is one of Saturn's 2 signs. The other is Aquarius. And if Aquarius is a forward-looking sign concerned with the reform of systems and mental structures, then Capricorn is an earth sign that is more concerned with the tangible and which looks more to the past. But in world astrology, it has a lot to do with traditional established institutions and that which has endured from the past. So with Pluto in Capricorn, what we saw was the emergence of a lot of hidden truths that were lurking under the surface of the status quo. We saw the faith in various traditional institutions undermined by explosions of rage at injustice. Now we're going to examine those 15 years of history, but we're going to pay particular attention to Pluto's movements through those 5 bounds of Capricorn. And before we get into this, a couple of quick notes. A lot of the issues I'm going to be raising are extremely politicized. I'm going to try and raise them in a relatively neutral way, and ultimately, however I frame these issues, it's probably going to piss some of you off. Believe it or not, my intention isn't to score partisan political points. If you do take offense, just know that I'm a flawed human being, but I love you. The second thing to note is that Pluto is the furthest planet from the Sun and it moves very slowly. And due to retrogrades, it progresses 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which means it moves in and out of signs and it moves in and out of the terms. So just bear that in mind if you find some of the dates I give a little bit confusing. But without further ado, here goes. 15 years of history told through Pluto and the bounds. Now, Pluto entered Capricorn for the first time on January the 26th, 2008. And of course, this put Pluto into the Mercury bound of Capricorn. And Mercury is the planet associated with trade and markets. And what happened at this time? Well, 2008 saw the greatest financial crisis to hit the world in decades.
Its effects and of the recession that followed on income, wealth, inequality, and our politics are still with us.
And while Pluto had been in the previous sign, exuberant Sagittarius, the US housing market had grown red hot. Mortgage lenders had become increasingly reckless in terms of who they lent money to, and banks had found very clever ways to hide the growing risk in the system in complicated financial instruments. And in late 2008, the whole house of cards collapsed, and huge financial institutions got into a lot of trouble. Now, there are other ways you could see this astrologically, including the opposition of Saturn and Uranus at the time, but you should see Pluto through the bounds as a kind of layer, an additional layer we can use as well as these other transits. So with the entire financial system about to collapse, governments chose to bail out a lot of huge banks using plutonic quantities of public money. And so a harsh truth about the financial system had been exposed. It had become a casino in which the players couldn't lose, because the public had to pay up to keep the system afloat. Remember, Pluto is about the revelation of hidden truths. And what happened didn't go unnoticed. An entire generation of millennials who tried to enter the job market then were hit really hard. And that had consequences. Robert Schmidt, a pioneer in the reconstruction of Hellenistic astrology, said that Mercury's primary functions were to contest and destabilize. And we all know what Mercurials are like. They like to argue, they like to critique. And not long after that, in the West, the Occupy Wall Street protests began on September the 17th, 2011. This was a massive street campaign against financial injustice and the money in politics, and it was a response to what happened in 2008. And during this same period, on January the 3rd, 2009, we saw the release of Bitcoin, which is a technology aimed at challenging and transforming the monetary system. And in the Middle East, at the end of 2010, we saw the first stirrings of the Arab Spring. It's seen as beginning when a Tunisian man, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in protest against oppression by government officials.
When Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire 10 years ago, he couldn't have known that his suicide in Tunisia would ignite the entire region.
It was a gesture of sheer desperation, but it set off a protest movement across the Arab world. And we saw an eruption of tremendous power. It was very Plutonic. So all in all, Pluto's time in the Mercury bound was a time of financial catastrophe and protest. If you're enjoying this content, I'd be terribly grateful if you just click that like button. And if you're new here, why not hit the subscribe button too? There is much, much more of this kind of content if you like what you see. On February the 24th, 2011, Pluto reached 7 degrees of Capricorn, which is where Jupiter's bound begins. Now, the 2nd century astrologer Vettius Valens said that Jupiter was associated with release from bonds. And more generally, Jupiter is associated with growth and expansion. And during this period, the Arab Spring really exploded across the Middle East. And in places like Syria, Iraq, and Libya, bloody civil wars broke out with devastating consequences for the people of that region. But Pluto is a planet of extremes, and another one of Jupiter's core meanings is faith. It was at this time that we really saw the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, and we saw one of the world's great faiths distorted by violent reactionary zealotry. And another key meaning of Jupiter is justice. In the United States, in July 2013, George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. The outcome of this case led to outrage among many Americans and the emergence of Black Lives Matter. This was a movement seeking to expose and campaign against police violence against black people in America and push for justice in the legal system. Again, Pluto is about the revelation of the hidden, and here we see a movement that wants to expose the hidden truths of racial injustice in the United States. Now, on January the 25th, 2015, Pluto reached 14 degrees of Capricorn, which put it into the bounds of Venus. And just a month after that, a certain celebrity announced he was going to run for president.
I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
And from this point on, Trump was the only story in town. In his book, The Book of Instruction of the Elements of the Art of Astrology, the medieval astrologer Al-Biruni describes the classes of people associated with Venus as nobles, plutocrats, queen courtesans, adulterers, and their children. Read that how you will. Trump was a TV star and a real estate mogul. In other words, Pluto had selected a Venusian figure as its vehicle of transformation.
You're fired.
And incidentally, in the whole sign houses house system, Trump has Pluto in his first house of Leo, and he has Venus ruling his Taurus midheaven. We've seen how Pluto was about the surfacing of hidden truths, and that's really what Trump did. He repeatedly spoke the unspeakable, said the quiet part loud. This delighted his supporters and outraged his opponents, but it made sure that he was at the top of the news agenda every day throughout his candidacy and his presidency. So whatever you think about Trump, his words undoubtedly dragged suppressed issues, kicking and screaming, into visibility. And one of the notable developments during this period came when a recording surfaced of Trump talking about his relationship with women.
And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
And this really sparked something. Women around the world began to publicly reveal the abuse they'd suffered at the hands of men. The Me Too movement was born. And many of the men who were accused were powerful figures in the entertainment industry. Think Harvey Weinstein. Remember, we have the Venus bound of Capricorn, which we can think of as Hollywood here. And the reality of how pervasive sexual assault and harassment was in the world was made plain to see. Truths, once again, brought to light from the underworld. And this had a serious, transformative effect on gender relations, one which is still playing out. So this is a way we can see Trump as a vehicle of Plutonian transformation. Now I'm just going to interrupt the narrative for a moment to tell you that I'm currently taking bookings for private consultations. I use a range of modern techniques that you might have heard of, like transits and progressions, as well as a few traditional ones you may not know, like the decans, like lots, like zodiacal releasing and profections, to help my clients understand their past, their present, and their future. And I'm focused on helping people find purpose and calling in their lives. If that sounds interesting to you, then head to my website, the link's in the description below, and book a slot. Can't wait to talk to you. Okay, let's get back to it. Now on February the 12th, 2019, Pluto reached 22 degrees of Capricorn. This put it in Saturn's bound. And as we've seen, Pluto moves forwards and backwards, and it entered Saturn's bound for the final time on December the 29th, 2019. And I think we all know what happened next.
We're going to begin here with the outbreak of a mystery virus in China that now has the World Health Organization on edge. At least 4 people have died and hundreds more are sick.
Now, as with everything that I've talked about so far, you can see the pandemic with other astrological factors, such as the conjunction of Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter in Capricorn in January 2020. But Pluto in Saturn's bound also speaks pretty loudly. Saturn was associated with death and disease, and with limits, restriction, and denial. And if you think back to the pandemic period, it displaced Trump from the top of the news agenda. Of course, Trump's handling of the pandemic became part of the story, but suddenly he wasn't the only thing the media was talking about. Pluto has a lot to do with power, and one of the consequences of the pandemic was a drastic empowerment of government all around the world. Across the whole planet, we had the imposition of lockdowns that forced people to stay at home. These were extremes, Pluto, of restriction, Saturn. And of course, the pandemic unleashed all sorts of other forces. For some, it showed the need to assert more control and to prevent misinformation from damaging public health. And for others, it showed quite the opposite. It was the overreach of government and experts which was the problem. So all of this widened societal divisions once again. We'll see the effects of that in the coming years. The other major development in this period was the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted following the police killing of George Floyd. And something that really stands out here during these protests was the destruction of statues of men connected to the slave trade. Saturn is the star of Nemesis. It was said to be able to raise people up to great heights, but bring them low as well. And here we see that process writ large. We see historical figures who were once deemed respectable cast down from their perches. February the 27th, 2021, Pluto reached 26 degrees of Capricorn, putting it into the last bound of the sign. This was the Mars bound, the planet of conflict. And very soon after that, in March and April 2021, Russia began to build up military forces on its border with Ukraine.
Ukraine has accused Moscow of building up troops on its border. According to reports, Russia is moving tanks, armored personnel carriers, and other equipment.
Now, Pluto retrograded out of that bound in June 2021, but it re-entered it for the last time on January the 3rd, 2022. And very soon after that, on February the 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we find ourselves now in this final phase of Pluto's transformative work in Capricorn. This time we're seeing the world transformed through conflict. And once again, it was remarkable to see how quickly the subject on everybody's lips changed from COVID-19 to the war. And we're getting lessons on the subject of power, particularly in terms of geopolitics. Now, Pluto is about to leave the Mars bound of Capricorn on March the 23rd, 2023. But it will actually move in and out of Aquarius a couple of times before finally settling into the sign in November 2024. At that point, we'll be truly into the Pluto-Aquarian era. So Pluto won't be done with Mars's bound of Capricorn until then. And so we're, of course, very early on in seeing what the full consequences of the war will be and what Pluto's really up to. So let's try and pull all this together now. With Pluto moving through those bounds of Capricorn, we saw the expression of a lot of dissatisfaction with established institutions. We saw a lot of rage against patriarchy, against racism, against sexism, against disparities of all kinds. And at the beginning of the transit, with Pluto in the bound of provocative Mercury, Occupy Wall Street really posed a question. How will the establishment change to accommodate dissatisfaction with what happened in 2008 and more generally with critique from the left? Now, we didn't see a lot of change in terms of economic equity since that time. If anything, it got worse. But I would invite you to consider how the predominant established ideology has changed over the past 15 years and how it seems to have shifted in response to many of the issues that we saw coming up as Pluto move through the bounds of Capricorn. But we should also bear in mind that Pluto in Capricorn has historically been more of a setup for truly revolutionary changes that came while Pluto was in Aquarius. Now, in the next video of this two-part series, we're going to try and get some insight into how Pluto's coming transit through Aquarius could play out. And we're going to do it by looking to the past, to the last time Pluto was in Aquarius from 1777 to 1798. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution and the French and American revolutions. And we're going to apply this same approach again. And we're going to see how the phases of these revolutions can be seen once again in light of Pluto's movement through the bounds of Aquarius. But before then, if you want a better understanding of the astrology of the 2020s, then I suggest you watch this video, the first in a 4-part series I made with S.J. Anderson. In this series, we broke down the major astrological developments of the decade, including Pluto in Aquarius. See you next time.